Thank you very much. It's an honour to be here. It's also an honour to be taking part in this national project. We present some data that's come not just from my state, but from all over Australia. As Jen mentioned, this is a massive project. I've only included 3 states worth of collaborators in this slide, and not all of them. So there are many, many people who are involved in the EDNA program. I was asked to provide a little bit of information on GHB, which I've had to squeeze in before my slides I had planned to do. So let's hope we don't go too quick. So GHB, as probably a lot of you know, is a naturally occurring neurotransmitter. It's a CNS depressant and hypnotic. So starts off okay with effects that include relaxation, euphoria, increased libido, and then starts going downhill when we get to drowsiness, hypertension, and leading to respiratory depression and coma. Could also lead to significant withdrawal symptoms, and at least the clinicians in Adelaide have often mentioned that how difficult it is to treat people who are dealing with GHB withdrawal. It doesn't seem to be anything they can use to counteract it. When it comes to the context of use, look, it's anyone's guess what's really happening on the ground. It's hard to tell, even though they're just over there using it. It's just hard to get the information out of that, how drugs are being used. But historically, it started off, I guess, as a bodybuilding supplement, when it started getting really popular, and then moved on to recreational club scene and chemsex and that sort of thing, which a lot of people still associate with GHB use, especially in Europe, where I was recently presenting this work. There's also there's always been conjecture about it being used in drug-facilitated sexual assault, but because of its half-life, it's very difficult to prove that's actually occurred. And it's also very common to be seen in conjunction with stimulants. As I said, it's got a very short half-life, so it makes it undetectable in urine within 10 hours. Blood concentrations, they're just very rough numbers, and it also obviously depends on the person who's taking it in individual circumstances. We mentioned that just before we had the question about GHB, whether it's 1,4-butane-diol, which is a solvent, industrial solvent, and used in cleaning and things like that, as well as GBL, also a solvent. They can both be converted quite easily into the body into GHB. And 1,4-butane-diol is converted by the same system that metabolizes alcohol. So there may be some interaction with alcohol consumption delaying the formation of GHB. And when it comes to toxicological analysis, GHB often needs a specific method. So often it's not necessarily analysed by a lot of laboratories, depending on the sample. And sometimes, depending on the laboratory's method, it's difficult to distinguish between whether GHB is being taken, whether GBL is being taken, or butane-diol is being taken. So our results are basically just GHB detected. We don't know where it's come from. GHB is an S9 prohibited substance, so there's no real need, there's no legitimate use to have it, in Australia at least. But GBL and 1,4-butane-diol are S10, so they are not necessarily controlled at the border, the international border, but they are sort of controlled within states. So in order to have GHB, you have, in order to have butane-diol and GBL, you need to have an end-use statement and under various Controlled Substances Acts around Australia. This graph's pretty complex. It's from the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission report from 2019-20. If you just look at the red line there, I guess is the most easy one to see, that GHB or fantasy-related seizures have been increasing for over a decade. Some of this high GHB data that we're seeing in the ED, I think the only people who weren't very surprised were the illicit drug chemists and police, people involved in drug seizures. A couple of examples of some exhibits that we see, some small, on the left, we have some butane-diol that was just seized recently in Adelaide. There was several cartons of those bottles. There's also GBL has been seized as a beauty product. I think it was for eyelash removal, something like that. We also get it in big containers, so not necessarily we as in Australia, but we in South Australia, but in Australia we've seen very large seizures of 1,4-butane-diol on the left there and GBL on the right. Okay, so now back to my original slides that I was going to present. So this work is relating to GHB detections in the emergency department in the EDNA program from 2022. I've deleted that on this slide. 2020. What year was it, Jen? We'll work on that later. I'm sure there's a slide here that will tell us. And so the centres that were involved were Chem Centre, the states that were involved were Western Australia, South Australia and Victoria, just due to the timeline of implementation of the project. And it's a great collaboration that we have between the forensic toxicology facilities, because there's very passionate people within those laboratories who just love looking at this stuff, but they don't have a lot of time. So these sort of distractions are great for them, great for me. And the reason why we're talking about forensic toxicologists is because we've got a great deal of expertise in detecting a wide range of drugs in blood, and not many other laboratories are able to do that sort of thing. So that's why we teamed up. So there are some limitations, of course, as with any survey type data that you get. So there's different ethical rules within each state. So comparing state to state is not always possible. Some states actually have a limit on the number of samples. So not all of the samples that are collected in the hospitals are actually put through to the laboratory. And of course, we've got to acknowledge that the proportions that we see in the ED are not necessarily going to represent the proportions that we might see in the drug using community. But having said that, I'm going to make those extrapolations anyway. So we had, in this period, September 20 to 22, we had 862 enrolments, which is a lot, and 62% were male and 38 female. But when it came to GHB positives, it sort of evened up a fair bit, so that there was 20% overall GHB positives, which is a lot of people, right? That's nuts. And we've noticed this for a while. But also what was also interesting in this early data was that a roughly 50-50 male-female ratio. So there's obviously a skew towards female use there. I believe it's sort of leveling out a little bit more back towards the 60-40% ratio, but we'll have more information on that later. Also importantly, there's about 20% were admitted to the intensive care unit, and a large proportion of patients who were in intensive care enrolled in this project were there because of GHB. So there's some pretty important drug, I think. I'm not quite sure if anyone's interested in GHB concentrations, but they range from just down to from our detection limit, about 5 or 10 most states, up to about 240, but there were some really spectacular concentrations. But considering the very short half-life that GHB has, within an hour, the concentration can halve. So who knows what the original concentration was. So it's difficult to map concentrations to effects that the clinicians are recording. When it comes to the setting, about 40%, most of them were either in a public environment or a patient's primary address. About 40% were in a public environment, and also 24 in the primary address of the patient. When it comes to other, that included mostly hotel accommodation, followed by a few supermarkets and medical clinics, depending on what the clinician noted. So within the data, there's space to put in free text comments, and these are just some of the free text that we might see, just some examples of various locations and circumstances that people were found in. Hope you had time to read that, running out of time. So drugs co-detected with GHB. So this is just the GHB positives. So methamphetamine was detected in 91%. So virtually every GHB patient, 9 out of 10 GHB patients had meth on board. That's not necessarily unexpected, because we know that GHB and meth go together pretty well. That's been used together for decades. But I guess the surprising thing is the number of patients that were the high proportion in the study that we're seeing. When it comes to the concentrations, the range from down around the detection limit of 0.01 mg per litre up to about 0.8. And why that's interesting is that's the sort of concentrations we see typically in drugs and drivers samples. It's about the same sort of range. We also see some very high concentrations, 2.1 mg per litre is quite high. So some people can tolerate that sort of level, but they're sort of tending to be in a bit of trouble. So I've run out of time. The pilot study that we did back in 2018, we had 106 enrolments, and we also found a high percentage of GHB there. NCRED provided us a capacity building grant in 2019, which enabled us to sample over 1,000 samples, and was a fantastic benefit to this whole program. In that program, we had 27% GHB positives, and again, very high co-detection rate. And also, females were overrepresented in the GHB cohort as well. There's a paper there that we wrote on that. And there's also been a paper in Western Australia from 2021. So this has been happening for a while in the emergency department. So I think our initial pilot study was started in about 2017, early 2018, yeah. So GHB in the study cohort appears to be broader than what a lot of people think GHB and meth are used for, just based on the pure numbers and a lot of the comments in the free text, just based on that information. And maybe we'll get some more survey results later on to find out what's going on there. But it's obviously very closely associated with meth use. Possible contributors to the high proportion of GHBs, just some ideas that GHB basically is a very risky drug. So 1 in 5 people who are a long-term user of GHB ends up in hospital at some point. But also meth is a dominant stimulant of use in Australia. So is it just because people on meth like to use GHB to assist in their come down or try to control or moderate their methamphetamine use? I don't know. I'm just a guy in a lab. Yes, and also maybe it just provides a desirable effect. So, I mean, after all, that's why people take drugs in a lot of cases, I guess. So, in conclusion, GHB is a pretty common drug, to say the least, in the study, and it was very often detected with, or virtually always detected with meth. It'll be interesting to see how the skew towards a female use of GHB use turns out over the years. And this is what we said at toxicology conferences, that because of this seemingly wider range of GHB use, it may be wise in the toxicology analysis context to start analysing samples that you wouldn't normally analyse for GHB. So, for example, don't target sexual assault samples for GHB, target your drivers. So that's which is what we've done in South Australia. So, yes, I think just like to acknowledge the clinicians. They've been fantastic. And the EDNA team in Western Australia is amazing. And also all the forensic toxicology staff at every centre that we're involved with. Thank you very much.